على مدى اليوم وغدا
attend the annual Muwatin Institute conference in its 23rd version, and which we allocated to deal with issues of democracy in the public square. This is the second conference in Birzeit University of Muwatin. You are welcome in the university and especially in this conference. In a while we will open our workshop through the president of the university, Dr. Abu Hijli, but allow me to address your attention that there is simultaneous translation from and to English. So those who need, please take the earphones. And I want to tell you also that the publications of Muwatin Institute are there, where you can find books that have been published over 2 decades about special studies on citizenship, democracy, political system, and otherwise. Today and tomorrow we will endeavor together to explore the issues related to democracy locally and globally, and we will listen to a number of experts in the field, starting with the president of Birzeit, this democratic base that has done concrete steps and honoring steps in the smooth steadfastness. I call Dr. Abdul Latif Abu Hijli to welcome you all and open the proceedings of the conference. Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As the participants in the proceedings of this conference, the audience, it is an honor for me to inaugurate this conference by welcoming you in Birzeit University, where we are proud of the tradition that has become an annual event that people expect and that is broadly given importance to. And it is because this conference also raises many questions that concern the sectors that are broader than Birzeit and that are of concern of the young people and building the future of generations. And it raises a number of questions about the role. What kind of future for the youth? For that, I find that this is a model in the work of the university in general and its institutes and centers particularly, that we give great importance to link up with the community, to be interactive and listen to the pulse of the street and to the local concerns, local and regional and international. I want to assure here that the vision and strategy of Birzeit University that requires several components, which is teaching, research, and planning, and interacting with the community, which is a central window for the relationship of the university with the community. And this is a precondition for the advance of the university and its endorsing in the society, and which is the starting point to protect and effectively to be sustainable and maintain its independence and its national orientation as well. And it's also an interaction at the global level, which is a basic component of this university that we were keen to maintain despite the challenges and obstacles that were facing this time. And in this context, I want to welcome our guests coming from outside Palestine to share with us this conference. The theme of the conference is vital. It does not stop in designing the political system as far as the elites and its institutions are concerned, but it goes to the higher goal of political organization and the responses of the political level. And it looks for liberation and emancipation and equality as well as justice, which are things that are very difficult to find Palestine under the circumstances we live in. Every day we have stories about teachers, guests and students who are not allowed to get once because of the roadblocks and once for isolating the West Bank from Gaza or Jerusalem, and sometimes these roadblocks and not giving permissions for those who want to study or work in the university. The documents of this conference indicate that to bring democracy for the daily and in the general phase to a central position in discussing democratic development in Palestine and in the world as well, and to have it over the agenda of the national concern in terms of developmental needs for Palestinian society. We aspire to develop Palestine that opens the space for the youth to find jobs and also for the teachers to conduct research scientifically and opening for a better life. Therefore, I agree with you that there is a need to study the nature of interventions that lead to this thing, otherwise we will face failure. And in the abstracts of the interventions, there are basic issues that need to be spread to the public discussions and to have the discussion over Palestine in a broader context in what's happening in the world in terms of unfolding events and linking up the local and the international in order to have sustainable rectifications that are needed. This conference is run with the phenomena of ending the division among Palestinians internally and to have the impediments for the national liberation and building democracy. And I hope that this will succeed and to be a starting point for patriotic work to consolidate democratic principles in Palestine. Finally, I welcome you all from all my heart, wishing you success in your proceeding and looking forward for your contributions, hoping that from these proceedings of these 2 days there will be a fruitful discussion and concrete results, and I hope that you will succeed to open a broader context and about the issues that are on the agenda. And finally, to thank you all and to Henrik Ford Foundation, Stiftung, and the global campus of the world for its support. And God bless. Thank you, Dr. Abdul Latif, for this expressive, meaningful word that has shed the light over the important thing. This Muwatin Institute was established in Beirut since a year and a half. They were keen on consolidating the achievements of Muwatin, and it is the main organizer of this conference, and to foster the identity, the renewing of the identity. Although we are in the first steps, but it is a promising thing. I welcome Dr. Mutar Qassis, the head of the Institute for Democracy, Muwatin Institute, to present his speech. Good morning. I reiterate welcoming you at the conference. It is not for increasing that we at Muwatin, that we are grateful for the community that presents the vital issues and the ability to have the scientific approach and to our connection and our organic relationship with our community. I see that it is my responsibility to share with you in a nutshell what we have done over the several months to prepare for this conference, and particularly in what is related to the main topic, its concept and its objectives. What disturbs us is our future. which is connected with what's unfolding in this world, that is passing through vast steps and transformations. The world looks small through the IT and communication, but it is bigger than what it used to be before, with all the wars exploding here and there, and the divisions and the increase in poverty and the widening gap between the mighty and the underdogs, and the world that is spending more than over arms more than ever in history. And we are approaching to a third world war, and since we have been with the two worlds, that when there was a setback for one of the most important moves towards freedom, justice, and multiplicity, solidarity, so that there is a very disturbing attack on democracy and the setbacks that are facing. And by the time we stop being able to maintain our national fabric and social fabric, and we were not sure anymore what we will do on the day that we will be emancipated, or how to get there. This is not the question of inaction or lack of concern, but because the alienation which is imposed on us on life requirements that are not emanating from our actual needs or our decision, but about the needs in order to commodify us and in order to undermine the thing and our struggle. I will not elaborate on to describe what we are passing through, but allow me to remind you of what's happening in these hours. A reconciliation plan in Gaza that we hope, we have hope, but we're not being sure. Like a football game, we support one party, but we cannot sort of be certain that it will actually win. But we deserve more from such a role in finding our future. There is one party that have clearly said what it wants. The government has said that it will act and it will wait how things will unfold and what will emanate from the discussions that have been held in Cairo. And the people hope without being sure of the outcome. And Hamas mentioned that there will be surprises, but it did not mention what kind of surprises. But Mr. Munib al-Masri, who is a central personality in the Palestinian private sector, he declared and reiterated that we need a holding company that will rebuild Gaza, and it will be called the Gaza Company for Development within the Chinese initiative to develop Gaza, and it has the approval of 70 countries, and that the Palestinian private sector has welcomed. So what is the position of the public sector from such a position? And the community, the NGO sector, and the teachers of politics and politics, and why do we discuss it in Beijing and Washington, New York, and Cairo, and not in Hebron, for example? What we hope, what we envisage, is to contribute in passing the discussion to the future to the public sector, the discussion from the corridors into the street. Otherwise, we will maintain our alienation that has transcended our heroic steadfastness in the field on our land. That we have been steadfast in order to maintain our cause, and we succeed, but the issue was taken to the corridors that we have no access to, and we hope to get this from corridors and put it at the public square. What I mean by referring to the cause, it is liberating the people first, and maintaining freedom secondly, and the liberation of the land as a third precondition to the first and second, which means income, being dependent and preventing any monopoly about the will or struggling for democracy as a precondition for all of this. This appears to be a difficult task, and it is becoming daily even more difficult when we started to have to emancipate democracy itself from its cover, a new cover that has deformed, distorted its and that we have the components of justice, of common sense, equality and freedom. And we often think about these slippery slopes, like the division between Gaza and this, and or the success of Trump in the elections, or that the racist right wing has had lots of votes, as well as in France and Germany, and we have to have more components about its mechanisms and its tricks, so that we are not taken by surprise one time after another. But what comes in my mind is difficult. I don't see that we are obliged. This is a leaking kind of structure, and it is about to fall. It's vulnerable, and it's not able to protect it. But those who live in it are those who have built it and designed it. Maybe it is high time for reconstructing it, reshaping it. I remind you, if this conference was held a few years ago, when there were the revolutions and uprisings in Egypt, Tunis, etc., and other countries, maybe its title would have been reforming or redesigning the social contract. And I don't see that there is a need for this to change. And if our democracy is a base in order to achieve the community will, let us continue drafting this and find ways and means to achieve it. And this will be democracy in its essence. In other words, why do we not redefine democracy rather than go into continuing thing or to interpret it as if it is sacred? It is not certainly a Holy Quran. I should mention another issue, that this is a task that the experts cannot deliver. It requires the strength popular and the youth encouragement and social wisdom and struggle component, and after this is the role of the academics, which comes last. I'm not here in order to say that we do not have a task to deliver, but it will be by the contribution capable to open the discussion in a broader way than we have got used when we frame our discussions within given issues that are not good, except to find a huge gap between theory and practice, what we call governance, democracy governance. But I am absolutely sure that the crisis of the future heralds for the birth of a new democracy that undermines it and undermines any kind of difficult birth that the father is not liking, and that this is a will of the people comes. And because we think that we can define democracy again, we try to draft a program that discusses certain persuasions in our daily life without stopping, putting a halt to the political system and the political, in order to devise, to come to the step, to the nativity of the concept and the people, and to the confers ambitions and aspirations of the people, not from a utopian sacredness, but as hope. I want to, but I would like to mention that this conference will take its international dimension because of the cooperation with Heinrich Stiftung. We are indebted, they were always there for us and supporting us. And they are existing in 100 countries, universities in the world in order to bring forward. And I thank all the contributors and their money. And one of the most elements for us is your presence here for the conference. Thank you, Dr. Mubarak. It is a very abundant, rich kind of thing, and the issue of democracy, that it is local, but it has also the dimension, such as the Institute. We are here in this limited geographic space. We are not in a ghetto or in an isolated cave. We have a credit that is calculated for us as proactive and interacting with the events. We are honored to have that. The opening words of this is important, that is well established. So Dr. Manfred Novak is the General Secretary of the European Center for University Cooperation, in addition to other fields that his experience from Bali in the earth to Guantanamo prison, passing from Bosnia and Herzegovina and Abu Ghraib prison, and that he deals with global main causes like torturing children. He was a judge in the human rights law, and also a secretary for the United Nations, and participating, in addition to his distinguished contributions to the university. I welcome Dr. John Manfred Novak, who will sort of contribute with us for his experience, his bit on the impact of neoliberalism on democracy. So he will be speaking in English. The floor is his.
Yeah, thank you, Joyce, for the very nice words of introduction. It's very good to be back in Palestine, and I'm very honored to also speak at the beginning. When we were, and Muda is not listening, so I have to, because I'm referring to you, when we were sitting under a tree in Mahidol University in Bangkok in May of this year, having a secret smoke, because Mahidol University does not allow smoking, and I'm happy that Birzeit University is more liberal in that way. So we were sitting there, and he told me that he is actually organizing this conference on democracy in the public square. Then I said, but yeah, we should actually put it in the context of the global campus of human rights. As Secretary General of the European Inter-University Center for Human Rights and Democratization in Venice, I'm also responsible to some extent for the global campus of human rights, which is now encompassing 7 regional master programs, and I'm very happy that in addition to the Arab master, there are also representatives here from the African master, from the Southeast Europe master, and from the European master here. But of course the Arab master is our youngest child, and Birzeit University played a very important role in establishing this master in the Arab world from the very beginning, and we now moved it also to Lebanon, so it will be fun. Yes. And we will officially open the first Arab Master in Democracy and Human Rights that is organized in Beirut later in October of this year. I was asked to speak about the impact of neoliberalism on democracy on a more broader level, and I'm very happy to do that, but I start, and I try to ask for the next slide, to make a very short introduction to how democracy can be defined from the perspective of international human rights. International meaning United Nations universal standard. And of course, there are a couple of rights. And I'm saying that because very often in development cooperation, etc., the term human rights is seen as a dirty word, something that you shouldn't mention because then you don't get funding and you have problems. So it's better you speak about democracy and good governance and these kind of things. Seeing democracy as the broader concept, I see human rights as the broader concept, and human rights and democracy are intrinsically linked, are interlinked, and that's what I want to show at the beginning very shortly. Perhaps the next slide. I don't know to whom I actually have to point. Yeah. Of course, the right of peoples to self-determination, which is a very important principle of the United Nations, but it is also a right of peoples in the two United Nations covenants, which are ratified more or less universally by all states in the world. And it very, very clearly says that there's a collective right of all peoples to freely determine their political status. When I'm teaching the right to self-determination and I'm asking the students, but what is a good example of a people that does not enjoy so far the right to self-determination? Usually the Palestinian people are the first ones that are mentioned. Of course, there are others in the Western Sahara, and we also have positive examples where peoples such as the people of South Africa or Namibia and later East Timor, and of course before in the whole decolonization process, actually were granted with the assistance of the United Nations their full right to self-determination, economic, social, but primarily also political self-determination. I mean, you know much more than I do, and we will discuss this, but this is the classical example that there is a people, the Palestinian people, that are still deprived of the right to self-determination. And that's the basis for every kind of democratic governance. Please, the next. And political rights in the more narrow sense are laid down in Article 25 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights as a very broad right and opportunity of every citizen to take part in the conduct of public affairs. Of course, I could now refer every time to the Palestinian people who are also deprived this right to participate in a very broad sense in the conduct of public affairs by means of direct or indirect representative ways of democracy. And the right to vote and be elected, of course, is at the center. It's probably the human right that has the strongest international monitoring through election monitoring by many different organizations that we see on a daily basis taking place. But the right to vote, in my opinion, is still the most important right relating to democracy, but there are also many others like the political freedoms, freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, freedom of the media, freedom of assembly, of association, are constitutive for a democratic culture. Again, there are limits to these rights and freedoms, but they are kind of the backbone of every functioning democracy, whatever type of democracy, and George Ulrich will later talk about different types of democracy. But I think without the freedom to express your political opinions, to form a political party, and to candidate in election, to be a candidate in elections, democracy will simply not function. equality and non-discrimination, for me, is as much at the core of every form of democratic governance, whether it's the old form of equality before the law, but in particular equal protection of the law against any forms of discrimination, exclusion on any ground, from gender, ethnic origin up to sexual orientation, and in particular minority participation in the political participation. And in a recent book, I tried to outline that also the right to equality and non-discrimination also implies for governments an obligation to avoid too much economic inequality. There is, if economic inequality, as we see today all over the world as a result of neoliberal policies, is reaching a certain level, then it really undermines the social cohesion and also the democratic legitimacy of a state. So that's why, because of the right to equality and non-discrimination, states do have an obligation to keep economic inequality, in particular income inequality, to a certain level. And I will come back to that in a moment. Please. Finally, in international human rights documents, we also have these limitation clauses, in particular to political freedoms. You have the right to express all kinds of opinions, but you also have a responsibility, in particular in the media, in order not to incite to racial hatred, for instance, or religious hatred. And that's why states always have to balance to what extent they have a right to restrict these human rights and in particular political freedoms. And already in the European Convention on Human Rights, you have this, this aspect that states are allowed to restrict and limit those freedoms, but only if these restrictions are necessary in a democratic society. And in order to know what it is, the European Court of Human Rights has developed already in the 1970s and 80s a very, very broad jurisprudence. And there it decided that the criteria of pluralism, tolerance, respect for the other, and broad-mindedness are very important elements of democracy. And it was taken over by the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations when they interpret legitimate restrictions, for instance, of freedom of assembly and freedom to demonstrate. So there is something in the very concept of human rights that you have to balance in a democracy legitimate restrictions, but on the other hand, only if they are really necessary. So usually freedom of expression is not there for those who kind of praise the government. It is there in order to also be shocking, to be outrageous, but there's a certain limit, and that is the limit of democratic society. Please. So what I would like to say in conclusion for this first part is that all major requirements of democratic governments, as I would define democracy, you find already in international and universal human rights instruments, as I have said before. So one might speak also of a human right to democratic governance, of course, primarily based in the right of peoples to self-determination, but also in all the other different rights that governments should actually respect, protect, and fulfill. Now I come to the second part, and that's the impact of neoliberalism on democracy. And I will of course, there are many aspects of neoliberalism in actually minimizing the role of the state in leading to, of course, much more power of transnational corporations and other global actors, financial markets, etc. But I take out two different elements of neoliberalism or consequences. One is the privatization of core state functions. And the other one is the rising economic inequality. And there you have one of the, in my opinion, most important graphs from the book of Thomas Piketty, Capitalism in the 21st Century. And I come back to that later, but you see here that in these 30 years after World War II until the 1970s, that you had and these are, I think it's difficult to see it now from here, but the United States, Britain, Germany, France, and Sweden, if you compare those 5 countries, that in those 30 years, despite a very strong economic growth, the level of inequality remained at a fairly low level. And then with the rise of neoliberalism in the late 1970s and 80s, 90s, etc., then you have a steep increase. You see on the top the United States, that the level of inequality today in the United States is fairly similar to the level of inequality in the United Kingdom in the late 19th and early 20th century, which was one of the reasons for the outbreak of World War I. Mudar was already speaking of the World War III. I mean, if you look at Thomas Piketty's kind of analysis on the basis of 30 years of data collection, very, very broad data collection on income tax, etc., that he would actually argue in the same way. In the United States, we are now at a level that really endangers already international peace and security. Next, please. Yeah. I was, again, the book you can see here, it's called Human Rights or Global Capitalism, The Limits of Privatization. I tried to look into how far state core functions that are important for the protection of human rights are going or have already been outsourced to the private sector, and whether there are limits within human rights that would actually prevent it. So in other words, to what extent these forms of privatization are already violating, are to be seen as retrogressive measures and therefore violating obligations of states. And I analyzed that in relation to a number of human rights, for instance, the right to education, that you have in many countries a trend towards privatization of education, which means that the basic right of all children to universal and compulsory free private education is actually compromised already. But the same is with the access to healthcare, to social security. I think a very good example of that is Chile. You know, in the 1970s when Mr. Pinochet, with a very bloody coup d'etat, deposed the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende in 1973, that then there were the so-called Chicago Boys. Those were Chileans who had studied in Chicago with Milton Friedman and others. Friedrich von Hayek, who's an Austrian who was kind of in the background of the neoliberal policies, and they were then given by the Pinochet regime free hands in order to kind of as a guinea pig, so they could actually develop what they have learned at the economic school in Chicago, and it had disastrous consequences. For instance, and that was primarily in the field of Social Security. For instance, the whole pension funds were abolished and replaced by private pension companies, so that everybody, so it's no longer the distribution and the kind of equal spread of the risks, but everybody kind of is responsible for his or her own pension in the future, and it really led to, again, economic inequality and poverty among many people in the Chilean society in the 1970s and 80s. If you look at the right to personal liberty, starting in the United States already in the 1960s, 70s, but primarily then under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, that more and more prisons became simply a business. So prisons were outsourced to private companies, profit-oriented companies, and at a certain point, in particular in the more southern states, they really became a very powerful factor, and that, of course, means if a prisoner is seen as a commodity, then you try to have full prisons, and it's the same persons who were running private prisons were also the ones who were lobbying for stronger, tougher criminal laws, and that's one of the reasons why we have in the United States a very sharp rise of the number of prisoners, of detainees. It's the highest in the world if you measure it according to 100,000 inhabitants. You have in the United States about 8 times as many prisoners than in the average in Europe, for instance. But of course, that was also taken over by actually this not really under Margaret Thatcher. It was at the end, it was more John Major and others who took it up, and Tony Blair continued with this policy. And today the United Kingdom is the country with the highest percentage of prisoners in private prisons in the world. About 15% of all prisoners are private in private prisons. But it was also taken over in many other states, in particular in the Commonwealth, in Australia and New Zealand, partly also in Germany. But in Germany, for instance, they stopped it again fairly soon after the German Constitutional Court intervened, which was similar also actually in Israel when the Supreme Court said that the privatization of prisons is violating the right to dignity and liberty of those individuals. And the same is with the right to personal security. That more and more the classical core function, and as the state has been defined since the 18th, 19th century, since the modern nation state, as the core functions is to protect internal and external security. If you more and more outsource the police to private military and security companies, then you might reach a level where the state is no longer able and willing also to provide personal security to its inhabitants. And we have many, when I was on an official mission in Papua New Guinea, and I talked to the head of the police forces there, he said, we have in a huge country like Papua New Guinea, we have about 1,200 police officers on whom I can still rely. And only one British private security company, G4S, based in London, the biggest one actually in the world, they have 4 times as many security officers than I have. And they pay higher wages. So my best people actually are always recruited by G4S. So it's a kind of, and he said himself, I mean, how shall I still maintain public order and security in the country when everything is taken over by private security companies. But it's as much in private military companies. It's even more dangerous how far we actually have gone in outsourcing also the military to private companies. The Iraq War has been often referred to as the first fully privatized war, because it was not only that the private military companies like Blackwater and CSCI and those were actually lobbying very strongly in the White House with Mr. Bush and others and Cheney to say that we need to actually intervene in Iraq. But secondly, altogether, about half of the soldiers now under quotation mark fighting in Iraq, American ones, about half of them were members of private military companies, and some of the worst crimes also have been committed by members of private military companies. I once did an investigation into the Abu Ghraib scandal and interviewed many of the victims or survivors of torture in Abu Ghraib, and what they told me was, of course, torture was rampant there, but the military, the US military, were still by far the best. The CIA people were already more brutal, but by far the most brutal torturers were members and agents of private military companies. So that is, I think, a very, very dangerous tendency if the decisions about fighting wars are outsourced, in fact, already to private military companies who, of course, have a big interest. And it's the same not only in the United States, it's the United Kingdom, it's South Africa, it's in the Russian Federation, and in many other countries that we have very active private military companies also playing a very important role in many of the African armed conflicts. Now, the last point is the rising economic inequality, and I referred already to the book of Thomas Piketty. That, of course, inequality decreased heavily because of the war economy in the First World War, because of the Great Depression, during the two World Wars, and then because of Second World War. So it was down from almost 50 to around 20, 25 by the end of World War II. Also, the New Deal contributed to this. And then in this next 30 years, as I said, there was a strong economic growth, but the economic policy in most European countries, whether they were, and also in the United States of America, whether they were led by social democratic parties or Christian democratic, didn't really make a big difference, was based on the policies of John Maynard Keynes. And that means a much stronger intervention in the anti-cyclical intervention into the economy, but also it means a social welfare state that at that time was developed, at least in most countries of Europe, and that kept the level of inequality at a fairly about very stable, about at the same 30. Maximum 35 according to the Gini index. And then you see a very, very sharp rise up to almost 50% now in the United States. And of course, other countries are even higher, like South Africa or the Southern African countries. Please, yeah. Anthony Atkinson was a British economist who unfortunately died last year, but he was one of the most outstanding economists, really doing for decades research on inequality, and he came up also with many proposals what could be done. So we know very well what states could do and should do in order to decrease economic inequality again. and I think it's again not easy to see, but that's the level of inequality. On top, you have the Scandinavian countries, which still have the lowest inequality or the highest economic equality, and then of all the highly industrialized states on top, you have the three countries. Those are here. That is the United Kingdom, the United States, and Israel. But then, of course, you have others like Mexico and, as I said, South Africa on top with about 60. But what is also interesting that the People's Republic of China, so the communist China, actually is second already. It's here. And Taiwan, the capitalist China, is somewhere here. So it means communist China has today one of the highest rates of economic inequality. They had a lot of economic growth, but what economists kind of foretell is that if this economic growth would actually fall under this magic mark of 4.5% per year, then China will be faced with very, very strong social struggles and social, so because of the high level of inequality with social problems. So we will see. Please. Yeah. These two aspects, and there are many more aspects, in my opinion, are the most important root causes for the current crisis of democracy. The two speakers before me already referred to that. And I would say on the one hand, I see a strong development from compromise to confrontation. We see that around the world that democracy, as I said before, it also means pluralism, means tolerance. It means you might have different opinions. You might be very sharp in your electoral campaigns, etc. But finally, you must be able to find a compromise in order to build a government, in order to solve problems, in order to work for your country. And what we see today in the United States of America, probably its strongest, I think President Obama wanted to become a president of all Americans. And finally, he failed in many of his projects because of a fundamental opposition from the Tea Party and other aspects of the Republicans. But you see the same in European politics. It's getting much tougher, much harsher. People are no longer really openly talking to each other. They simply talk against each other, and then it's very, very difficult to form a functioning government. That, of course, is very strongly linked to a rise of populism, also racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and violence, as we see everywhere, including also in the European Union. The rise of authoritarian rulers everywhere, not only in Russia or Turkey, but also within the European Union. Whether we look at Mr. Orban in Hungary or Jaczynski in Poland, and of course also with right-wing politicians like Marie Le Pen and others in France, and we just saw that in Germany, where recently the right-wing party got 13% of the votes, and in Austria we will have elections on the 15th of October, and we are very much afraid that we have again a right-wing government, a far right-wing government with very authoritarian people who actually openly advocate for new authoritarianism. We need the strong man again to rule our country, because democratic politicians are simply not able to govern anymore. So radicalization, and I mean, President Duterte in the Philippines is for me sort of kind of the classical example. The Philippines, with all their problems, were always a country that were governed by democratic structures and a fairly well-developed system of the protection of human rights. And now this is totally over. So I come to my last slide. What are the conclusions? I think they are fairly clear already. So on the one hand, democracy is built on human rights, but globalization driven by neoliberal economic policies led to this inter alia, to this privatization and rising economic inequality that is threatening the social coherence, and that is very, very important. A functioning democracy needs to be built on some kind of social contract, the social contract between those who are governed and those who govern. If this social contract does no longer work because of radicalization, because of also this huge economic inequalities, when people try to, and we have seen that, understand, blue-collar workers do understand that the CEO of the same company earns 10 times as much or perhaps 15 times as much, because they say, okay, we have less responsibility, he's working much more than we do, etc. But if it's 1 to 1,000, nobody would accept anymore that this person is 1,000 times as more profitable than we are. So, and that is this huge gap because of income inequality that people then feel, and that's also very, very clearly shown by evidence that today you can work a whole life, you can do very, very hard work. And in the times of the social welfare state, you knew then at the end of that, you can retire and you can kind of live from what you earned through your hard labor throughout your life. Today, this is no longer there. So it is, as Piketty says, it's better if you actually marry a rich person from the so like a little bit in the 18th century, because by inheritance people are, and of course by income from capital, that is much more important than income from labor, and that destroys the social coherence of societies. Democratic elections governed by primarily, and again we see that everywhere, by money, by capitalist interests, by lobbying. We see it in the dirty campaigning, we see it in the corruption, is a phenomenon of democracy more or less in all also so-called well-functioning democracies today. There's a very limited power of democratic governance over the economy, whether it's transnational corporations or the financial markets. They simply have lost control of economic power. That's why, in order to change that, we would really have to turn around so that the politics again, and that can only be done at the international level, politics again become governing the economy and not the other way around. There's widespread frustration with the results of democratic governance, and that leads, of course, to more, and that's the vicious circle, to more and more populism, radicalization, and new forms of authoritarianism. So that's a short overview, and I'm looking forward very much to many of the more targeted contributions that we hear throughout this conference. Of course, most of them related to the situation in Palestine, but some of them also going beyond and analyzing the crisis of democracy on a global level. Thank you very much.